On a crisp autumn morning in the suburbs of Seattle, the peaceful neighborhood of Oakwood Heights was about to witness an incident that would change lives forever. A black Mercedes coasted down Maple Avenue, its driver, a seasoned FBI special agent, headed to her parents' home for Sunday brunch. She'd been with the Bureau for 8 years, working her way up through determination and excellence. As she slowed down at a stop sign, blue and red lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Officer Reynolds, a 5-year veteran of the local police force, had noticed her license plate light was out. It seemed like a routine traffic stop, but what unfolded in the next few minutes would send ripples through the entire law enforcement community. The FBI agent calmly pulled over, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel as she trained countless others to do. Through her mirror, she watched the officer approach, his hand resting near his holster, a detail her trained eye couldn't miss. She remained composed, despite knowing something felt off about his unusually tense demeanor. "License and registration," Officer Reynolds demanded, his voice carrying an edge that seemed disproportionate to the situation. The agent carefully reached for her credentials, making sure to announce her movements. "Sir, I'm reaching for my FBI credentials and driver's license." "They're in my—" Before she could finish her sentence, Officer Reynolds cut her off. "Just get your license out slowly." His tone had grown even more aggressive, and his hand had moved closer to his weapon. She tried again. "Officer, I'm a federal agent. If you'll just let me show you my—" But things escalated quickly. Within seconds, Officer Reynolds had opened her car door, ordering her to step out of the vehicle. Despite her clear, calm attempts to explain her position, he wasn't listening. The situation spiraled as neighbors began emerging from their homes, cell phones recording the scene. The FBI agent found herself being handcuffed in her own neighborhood, less than 3 blocks from her parents' house, while trying to maintain her professional composure. She kept her voice steady, repeatedly identifying herself as a federal agent, but Officer Reynolds seemed determined to complete the arrest. A young couple walking their dog had stopped to witness the scene, their faces showing clear concern. The husband was already on the phone, presumably with 911, while his wife recorded everything. The FBI agent noticed this but remained focused on keeping the situation from escalating further. In the background, she could hear more sirens approaching. Her Sunday brunch plans had transformed into what would become one of the most significant moments in her law enforcement career, though not in the way anyone could have expected. The most frustrating part wasn't the handcuffs cutting into her wrists or the embarrassment of being arrested in her own neighborhood. It was watching Officer Reynolds repeatedly ignore her attempts to resolve the situation professionally. She'd spent years building bridges between law enforcement agencies, and now she was experiencing firsthand why such work was so desperately needed. As backup arrived and the situation began to unfold in front of more officers, the reality of what was happening started to sink in for everyone involved. Another police officer, Sergeant Chen, approached the scene more cautiously, taking in the growing crowd of onlookers and the unusual sight of a well-dressed woman in handcuffs, calmly explaining her status as a federal agent. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky as what should have been a simple traffic stop transformed into a watershed moment that would soon capture national attention. But unlike similar incidents that had ended in tragedy or bitter legal battles, this one was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge assumptions, change perspectives, and ultimately create a blueprint for turning conflict into progress. The neighbors watching from their porches and sidewalks couldn't have known they were witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. As Sergeant Chen finally convinced Officer Reynolds to check the FBI agent's credentials properly, the first chapter of this remarkable story was just beginning to unfold. The handcuffs would soon come off, but the implications of what had happened would remain firmly locked in place, setting the stage for what was to come next. The FBI agent, still maintaining her composure, knew this moment could either deepen the divide between law enforcement agencies or become an opportunity for real change. As she rubbed her wrists where the handcuffs had been, she was already formulating a plan that would surprise everyone involved, especially Officer Reynolds. What happened that morning on Maple Avenue wasn't just another case of mistaken identity or law enforcement overreach. It was about to become the catalyst for a transformation that nobody saw coming, least of all the officer who had made the wrongful arrest. The real story was just beginning, and its impact would reach far beyond the quiet streets of Oakwood Heights. The next few hours at the police station felt like a whirlwind of activity and tension. The FBI agent sat quietly in a conference room, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, while chaos erupted around her. Her FBI supervisor had arrived within 30 minutes of her call, his presence adding another layer of pressure to an already strained situation. The police station buzzed with nervous energy. Officers whispered in corners, stealing glances at the conference room where department heads were now gathering. Through the glass walls, the FBI agent could see Officer Reynolds sitting alone in another room, his face a mix of anger and fear as reality sank in. "This is a complete disaster," the police chief said, pacing the conference room. His uniform was crisp, but worry lines creased his forehead as he faced the FBI supervisor. "I want to assure you both that this isn't how we train our officers. This isn't who we are as a department." Local reporters had already caught wind of the incident. Their cars were parked outside the station, cameras ready to capture any statement or development. Cell phone videos of the arrest had started circulating on social media, adding fuel to an already volatile situation. The FBI agent watched as her supervisor leaned forward, his expression serious. "We need to address this immediately. The Bureau takes these incidents very seriously." But before he could continue, she raised her hand, surprising everyone in the room. "I'd like to suggest something different," she said, her voice calm but firm. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Instead of anger or accusations, they saw something unexpected in her expression, determination and purpose. She stood up, smoothing her jacket with steady hands. "We can handle this one of two ways. We can let this become another headline about police misconduct, another reason for division between agencies and communities. Or," she paused, making eye contact with each person in the room, "we can turn this into an opportunity for real change." The police chief stopped pacing, his attention fully captured. "What exactly are you proposing?" Over the next hour, she outlined her vision. Rather than filing charges or launching an investigation, she proposed developing a comprehensive training program. One that would address not just racial bias, but the complex dynamics between different law enforcement agencies. "I've seen both sides," she explained. "I've been a federal agent, but I've also been the person pulled over for no real reason. We can use this experience, my experience, to help officers understand these situations from multiple perspectives." The tension in the room began to shift as she spoke. The police chief's defensive posture relaxed slightly, and even her supervisor's stern expression softened. But not everyone was convinced. "And what about Officer Reynolds?" someone asked. "He's facing suspension, possibly worse." The FBI agent turned to look through the glass at Reynolds, who was still sitting alone, his career seemingly in tatters. "He should be the first participant in the program," she said firmly. "Not as punishment, but as an opportunity to learn and grow." News vans continued to gather outside as the meeting stretched into its second hour. Inside, something remarkable was taking shape. The police chief's initial skepticism was giving way to cautious optimism. Her supervisor, though surprised by her approach, began to see the potential impact of such a program. By late afternoon, what had started as a potential crisis was transforming into something unexpected. Preliminary agreements were being drafted, calls were being made to department heads and training coordinators. The FBI agent's proposal was taking root, growing from a simple idea into a concrete plan of action. As the day drew to a close, she gathered her belongings, exhausted but satisfied. Walking through the station, she passed Officer Reynolds, still waiting to learn his fate. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, she saw something that confirmed she'd made the right choice. A glimmer of shame, yes, but also uncertainty and fear. These were emotions they could work with, emotions that could fuel change. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Reporters called out questions as she walked to her car, but she merely smiled and kept walking. They would get their story, but not the one they expected. This wouldn't be another tale of conflict and division. Instead, it would become something far more powerful, a story of transformation and hope. As she drove home, finally heading to her parents' house many hours later than planned, she thought about the day's events. What had started as a routine Sunday morning had evolved into something that could potentially change hundreds of lives. The real work was just beginning, and she knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But sometimes the most meaningful changes come from the most unexpected moments. The next few weeks would test everyone's commitment to this new approach. But for now, she had taken the first step, turning what could have been another tragic headline into an opportunity for genuine progress. The question now was whether others would be brave enough to follow her lead. 1 week after the incident, the FBI agent stood before the police department's command staff in their main conference room. The morning light filtered through vertical blinds, casting alternate patterns of light and shadow across the faces of skeptical officers and concerned administrators. "I know this isn't a conventional approach," she began, her voice steady as she addressed the room. She'd spent days preparing this presentation, knowing everything hinged on these crucial moments. But conventional approaches haven't been working. We need something different. The room was packed. Some officers stood along the walls, arms crossed, while others sat forward in their chairs, curious about what this federal agent, whom they'd wrongfully arrested just days ago, could possibly propose. In the back corner, Officer Reynolds sat alone, his presence required as part of his disciplinary action. "My proposal is simple," she continued, clicking to the first slide of her presentation. "A comprehensive training program that brings together federal agents and local law enforcement, not just to talk about what went wrong, but to understand each other's perspectives and create real solutions." She outlined her vision, a 12-week program combining classroom sessions with practical exercises. It would cover everything from proper identification protocols to implicit bias training, but with a twist. Instead of the usual dry presentations, she proposed using real experiences, including her own, as teaching tools. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame," she explained, noticing how some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "It's about understanding. When I was handcuffed on Maple Avenue, I wasn't just experiencing it as a federal agent. I was experiencing it as a human being, as someone who's dedicated their life to law enforcement, just like everyone in this room." The police chief leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "And you're willing to lead this program yourself?" "After what happened?" "Especially after what happened," she replied, her conviction evident in her voice. "Because I believe that moment of conflict can become a moment of transformation, not just for this department, but for departments across the country." She clicked to the next slide, revealing statistics about similar incidents nationwide. The numbers were sobering, but her focus wasn't on the problems. Instead, she highlighted the opportunities for change, the potential for improvement, the possibility of building bridges between agencies that often viewed each other with suspicion. "Here's the unique part," she continued, moving through her presentation. "We're not just going to talk about these issues. We're going to recreate scenarios, role-play different perspectives, and most importantly, we're going to listen to each other's stories." As she spoke, she could see the tension in the room beginning to shift. Even some of the most skeptical officers were now taking notes, their expressions thoughtful rather than defensive. In the back, Officer Reynolds had uncrossed his arms, his posture more open than when the meeting began. She outlined the practical aspects: weekly sessions, guest speakers from various law enforcement agencies, community involvement, and most importantly, a focus on real-world application. "This isn't about checking boxes or fulfilling requirements," she emphasized. "It's about creating lasting change." The questions that followed were tough but fair. Officers wanted to know about time commitments, impact on regular duties, and most importantly, how this program would be different from the countless other training sessions they'd endured over the years. "Because this time, we're not just talking about change, we're living it," she answered. "I'm standing here today, not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a fellow law enforcement officer offering a path forward. That's the difference." She saved her most powerful point for last. Every person in this room has a story about why they chose this profession. We all wanted to make a difference, to protect and serve. This program isn't about changing who we are, it's about becoming better at who we already want to be. The presentation concluded with a silence that felt heavy with possibility. The police chief stood up, his expression thoughtful. "This is ambitious," he said finally, "but maybe that's exactly what we need right now." As the room began to clear, several officers lingered, wanting to discuss specific aspects of the program. Even Officer Reynolds approached, though he struggled to meet her eyes. "I want to be part of this," he said quietly. if you'll let me." She looked at him steadily. "That's exactly why I proposed it." Walking out of the station that afternoon, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The hard work was just beginning, but something had shifted today. In that room full of skeptics and believers, she'd seen the first sparks of real change. Her phone buzzed with messages from her FBI supervisor. Other departments were already expressing interest in the program. What had started as a response to one incident was growing into something bigger, something that could potentially reshape how law enforcement agencies interact with each other and the communities they serve. As she drove home, she thought about all the stories yet to be shared, all the perspectives waiting to be understood. This wasn't just about training anymore, it was about transformation, one conversation at a time. The first official training session opened in an atmosphere thick with tension. 24 officers sat in the department's training room, their expressions ranging from openly hostile to cautiously curious. Officer Reynolds sat in the front row, a decision that surprised many but spoke volumes about his commitment to the process. The FBI agent had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. "Today," she began, "we're going to do something different. We're not here to point fingers or assign blame. We're here to understand each other." She started with a simple exercise. Each person in the room was asked to share a moment when they felt misunderstood in their line of duty. The stories began slowly, hesitantly, but as each person spoke, something remarkable started to happen. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. One veteran officer described a tense situation where his good intentions were misinterpreted. Another shared how a simple traffic stop turned into a near disaster because of miscommunication. As each story unfolded, the invisible walls between federal and local law enforcement began to crack. "Now," she said, after the last story was shared, "let me tell you about that Sunday morning." The room fell silent as she recounted her arrest, not with anger or accusation, but with a focus on the emotions and thoughts that ran through her mind. She described the fear, the frustration, and most importantly, the realization that this moment could either divide or unite them. Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat as she spoke. When she finished, she turned to him. "Would you share your perspective of that morning?" The request caught him off guard, but after a moment's hesitation, he stood. His voice was shaky at first, but grew stronger as he spoke. He described the adrenaline, the training that kicked in automatically, and the assumptions he'd made without even realizing it. "I thought I was following protocol," he admitted, "but I wasn't really seeing the person in front of me." The breakthrough came during a role-playing exercise. Officers were paired up and given scenarios to act out, but with a twist, they had to switch roles halfway through. Federal agents played local officers played civilians, and everyone got a taste of life on the other side. During the breaks, conversations continued in the hallways and break room. Officers who had barely spoken to each other before were now engaged in deep discussions about their experiences. The walls weren't just cracking, they were beginning to crumble. But not everyone was convinced. A small group of officers remained resistant, viewing the training as an unnecessary response to what they considered a minor incident. The FBI agent noticed their crossed arms and skeptical glances, but she didn't push. Change takes time, she reminded herself. The afternoon session focused on practical protocols for interagency cooperation, but instead of dry policy reviews, she used real-world examples and invited officers to share their own experiences. The discussion became lively as people offered suggestions for improving communication between departments. One particularly powerful moment came when a senior officer stood up and shared a story he never told before. He described a situation where his pride and assumptions had nearly cost him his life. "If I'd just listened," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "if I'd just been willing to hear what the other person was saying, things would have gone differently." The impact of his words was visible across the room. Even the most resistant officers seemed to soften slightly. This wasn't just about following rules or checking boxes. It was about acknowledging their shared humanity and the complex challenges they all faced. As the first day drew to a close, the FBI agent noticed small groups of officers lingering, continuing discussions that had started during the sessions. Officer Reynolds approached her again, this time meeting her eyes directly. "I never thought about it this way before," he said quietly. "Thank you for giving me this chance." The real test would come in the weeks ahead as they delved deeper into more challenging topics. But something fundamental had shifted during that first session. The us versus them mentality was beginning to dissolve, replaced by a growing understanding that they were all on the same side. Walking to her car that evening, she overheard two officers discussing plans to meet for coffee and continue their conversation. Small steps, she thought, but significant ones. Real change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen, one conversation, one realization, one person at a time. The sun was setting as she drove home, casting long shadows across the city streets. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today had shown her that her unconventional approach might just work. The resistance wasn't gone, but the first seeds of change had been planted, and they were already beginning to grow. As the training program entered its 5th week, a remarkable transformation began to unfold. The FBI agent stood before the class, not as an outsider anymore, but as someone who had earned their trust. The room that once felt like a battleground now hummed with energy and engagement. Today's session focused on the hardest topic yet, personal biases and their impact on law enforcement decisions. The morning started with a powerful exercise. She dimmed the lights and played real body camera footage from various incidents across the country, carefully selected to show both successful and problematic interactions. Watch these, she instructed, not as officers but as human beings. The footage played, showing moments where split-second decisions changed lives forever. After each clip, she paused, allowing the weight of what they'd seen to sink in. Officer Reynolds, who had become increasingly involved in the program, raised his hand. "You know what I see now?" he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "I see how many of these situations could have gone differently if we'd just taken a breath, taken a moment to really see the person in front of us." His words sparked a deep discussion. Officers began sharing their own close calls, moments when they nearly made devastating mistakes, times when they did everything right but still faced criticism. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was honest, raw in a way that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. During the break, small groups formed naturally, continuing their discussions over coffee and snacks. The FBI agent overheard snippets of conversation that would have been unimaginable just weeks ago. Veterans were mentoring rookies, sharing wisdom earned through years of experience. Officers who once viewed federal agents with suspicion were now asking questions, seeking advice, building bridges. The afternoon session brought a surprise guest, a retired police chief from another state who had faced similar challenges in his department. He shared his experiences candidly, not sugarcoating the difficulties, but emphasizing the possibilities for positive change. "I wasn't sure about this program at first," one officer admitted during the Q&A session. "Thought it was just another PR stunt, but now I'm seeing things differently. I'm thinking differently out there on patrol." The real breakthrough came during a role-playing exercise. The scenario was simple but powerful. Officers had to experience situations from different perspectives. Some played civilians, others played officers from different agencies. The FBI agent watched as understanding dawned on faces, as empathy grew through experience. Officer Reynolds volunteered for one of the most challenging scenarios, playing the role of the federal agent being wrongfully detained. His hands shook slightly as he went through the exercise, but he didn't back down. When it was over, he sat quietly for a long moment. "I get it now," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I really get it." The impact of the program was becoming visible beyond the training room. Reports came in of improved interactions between agencies. Officers were taking extra time during stops, communicating more clearly, listening more carefully. Small changes, but significant ones. During the afternoon break, two officers approached the FBI agent with an idea. They wanted to start a mentorship program, pairing federal agents with local officers for regular ride-alongs and joint training sessions. The walls between agencies weren't just coming down, they were being replaced by bridges. The day ended with a powerful exercise in perspective-taking. Each person wrote down their biggest fear when interacting with law enforcement from another agency. The anonymous notes were read aloud, creating a moment of vulnerable honesty that touched everyone in the room. As the officers filed out that evening, conversations continued into the parking lot. Plans were made for coffee meetings, study groups, informal gatherings where these important discussions could continue. The training wasn't just changing minds, it was changing hearts. The FBI agent packed up her materials, feeling both exhausted and energized. A photo on the wall caught her eye. The department's first graduating class from decades ago. Times had changed since then, she thought, and they were changing still. Outside, the evening was settling in, but several officers lingered, deep in conversation. Officer Reynolds was among them, gesturing animatedly as he discussed a point from the day's training. The transformation in him was perhaps the most visible sign that the program was working. Driving home, she reflected on how far they'd come. The resistance wasn't completely gone. Change never comes easily, but something fundamental had shifted. These weren't just training sessions anymore. They were becoming catalysts for real transformation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities for growth. But today had shown that even the deepest biases could be examined, the strongest walls could be breached, and the most resistant hearts could be open to change. One story, one exercise, one realization at a time. The transformation that began in a suburban police department was about to take an unexpected leap forward. 8 months after that fateful Sunday morning arrest, the FBI agent found herself standing on a stage at a national law enforcement conference with Officer Reynolds beside her. The audience, filled with police chiefs, federal agents, and law enforcement officials from across the country, listened intently. "We're here to share a story," she began, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "Not just about what went wrong one Sunday morning, but about what went right in the months that followed." The lights dimmed as video clips from their training sessions played on the large screen behind them. Officer Reynolds stepped forward, his confidence now a stark contrast to the defensive, angry officer from that first day. "I was that officer," he admitted, his voice steady. "The one who made assumptions, who acted without thinking, who let bias cloud my judgment. But standing here today, I'm someone different." The presentation moved beyond their personal story to show the concrete results of their program. Crime statistics, community feedback, and interdepartmental cooperation had all improved dramatically. But the most powerful evidence came from the officers themselves, shown in before and after interviews that captured their evolution. During the Q at a session, hands shot up across the auditorium. Police chiefs wanted to know how to implement similar programs. Federal agents asked about cooperation protocols. The interest wasn't just polite attention, it was urgent, eager, hungry for solutions. The key, the FBI agent explained, isn't just in the training materials. It's in creating space for honest conversations, for uncomfortable truths, for real change. She shared how their program had evolved, adapted, grown stronger through challenge and criticism. Officer Reynolds then described a recent incident where his new training had made a crucial difference. "I encountered a situation almost identical to our first meeting," he said, looking at his former arrestee with respect. "But this time, I handled it completely differently. The outcome wasn't just better, it was transformative." During the lunch break, they were surrounded by conference attendees eager to learn more. The FBI agent watched as Officer Reynolds handled questions with patience and insight, sharing his experience with a humility that made his message even more powerful. A reporter from a major law enforcement journal approached them. "Your story is spreading," she said. "Departments across the country are asking about your program. How does it feel to be creating this kind of change?" The FBI agent smiled, remembering that morning on Maple Avenue. "It feels like this is just the beginning," she replied. The reporter scribbled rapidly, sensing the magnitude of what was unfolding. The afternoon sessions focused on practical implementation. They shared their curriculum, their methods, their mistakes, and their successes. Other departments began sharing their own experiences, creating a ripple effect of positive change. One powerful moment came when a police chief from a major city stood up. "We've been trying to address these issues for years," he said, his voice carrying years of frustration and hope. "But seeing your results, hearing your story, this is different. This could work." Officer Reynolds had his own moment of triumph when he presented their de-escalation techniques to a breakout session. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls, all there to learn from someone who had once been an example of what not to do. As the conference drew to a close, requests poured in for training materials, consultation, and program implementation. What had started as a response to one incident was becoming a movement for change in law enforcement agencies nationwide. Back in their hotel lobby that evening, the FBI agent and Officer Reynolds sat reflecting on the day. "Did you ever imagine," he asked, "that morning when you were putting me in handcuffs that we'd end up here?" She shook her head, smiling. "Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes if we're brave enough to learn from them." The next morning, as they prepared to head home, their phones buzzed with messages from departments across the country. The story had gone viral in law enforcement circles. Their program wasn't just a local success anymore, it was becoming a national model for change. On the flight home, they began sketching out plans for the next phase. Training other trainers, developing online modules, creating a network of departments committed to this new approach. The work was far from over, but now they had proof that change was possible. Looking out the airplane window, the FBI agent thought about all the officers who would be touched by this program, all the communities that would benefit, all the incidents that might be prevented. From one moment of conflict, a movement for understanding had grown. As they landed, Officer Reynolds turned to her. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself that day." It was a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of grace. 3 years after that life-changing Sunday morning, the FBI agent stood in the newly dedicated training center, looking at the wall of success stories. What had started as a response to her wrongful arrest had grown into something far beyond anyone's expectations. The statistics told part of the story. A 60% reduction in interdepartmental incidents, a 45% improvement in community relations, and dramatic increases in successful joint operations between local and federal agencies. But the real story was in the lives changed, the bridges built, and the relationships forged. Officer Reynolds, now promoted to training coordinator, was leading a session in the next room. Through the window, she could see him engaging with a new group of officers, his hands moving animatedly as he shared his experiences. His transformation had become legendary in law enforcement circles. The center itself was a testament to their success. What began in a small conference room had grown into a state-of-the-art facility, complete with simulation rooms, conference spaces, and advanced training technology. Departments from across the country sent their officers here for training. "Remember when this was just an idea?" the police chief asked, joining her at the window. He'd been one of their earliest supporters, taking a chance on an unconventional approach. Now his department was considered a national model for progressive law enforcement training. The morning's mail had brought more success stories. A letter from a department in Texas described how their program had prevented a potentially volatile situation between local and federal officers. Another from Florida detailed improved community relations after implementing their training methods. In the break room, officers from different agencies chatted easily over coffee. The old tensions, the territorial disputes, the mutual suspicion, all had given way to something new. Not perfect, but better, much better. The FBI agent's phone buzzed with a message from a national police academy. They wanted her to keynote their upcoming graduation ceremony. These invitations came regularly now, opportunities to share their story and spread their message of transformation. Walking through the facility, she passed the Wall of Change, a collection of before and after testimonials from officers who'd completed the program. One particular note caught her eye. "I came here thinking I knew everything about being a good officer. I left understanding that being a good officer means never stopping learning." The afternoon brought a visit from a documentary crew, filming a series about positive changes in law enforcement. They wanted to capture the essence of what made this program different, what made it work when so many others had failed. "It's not just about training," she explained to the interviewer. "It's about transformation. We're not just teaching new skills, we're changing hearts and minds." The cameraman zoomed in as she shared stories of officers whose lives had been touched by the program. Outside, a group of new trainees practiced scenario-based exercises in the courtyard. Federal agents, local officers, and state troopers worked together, learning to see situations from multiple perspectives. The sound of their engaged discussions drifted through the open windows. Officer Reynolds joined her later in her office, bringing the latest feedback reports. "You know what's amazing?" he said, settling into a chair. "We're not just changing how officers interact with each other. we're changing how they see themselves. The day ended with a graduation ceremony for the latest class of trainees. As she watched them receive their certificates, she remembered that morning on Maple Avenue, how one moment of conflict had sparked a movement for change that continued to grow. In her closing remarks to the graduates, she shared something she'd learned over the past 3 years. Real change doesn't come from policies or procedures alone. It comes from people willing to learn from their mistakes, to see beyond their biases, to believe in the possibility of something better. As the sun set over the training center, she gathered her things to head home. On her desk sat a framed photo from that first training session, a reminder of how far they'd come. Next to it lay plans for future expansions, new programs, more opportunities to spread their message of transformation. The legacy they'd built wasn't just about improving law enforcement, it was about proving that positive change was possible, that conflict could lead to connection, that even the most difficult moments could become catalysts for something extraordinary. Walking to her car, she passed another group of officers arriving for evening training. Their eager faces reminded her that every day brought new opportunities for change, new chances to make a difference. The work wasn't over, it was just beginning. The story that began with a wrongful arrest had become a blueprint for transformation, a testament to the power of turning conflict into opportunity. And somewhere on another Maple Avenue, another officer was making a choice that would shape lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine.